Before we start, can you just let me know if you can see the PPT and if you can hear me well? And once I have this confirmation, we will get started. Are we good? You can use the chat box to drop a message. Okay. All right. Good. And look, I have a new mic, so you should hear me even better compared to yesterday. The sound should be better, hopefully. Okay. So the two previous webinars were dedicated to the study of perfect competition. Today we will focus on, we can call it the opposite market structure, monopoly. Again, this is a big topic, so I will not be able to cover the entire module in just one webinar. So we'll break it into two parts. And today the main objective will be to define a monopoly market, to study the characteristics of this market, to explain how the monopolist is going to make decisions in this particular market. And then we will compare the outcome of the market equilibrium in a monopoly. We will compare it with the outcome that we would have achieved if the market were perfectly competitive. And then tomorrow, perhaps not tomorrow, I might take a few days off, but when we meet again, we will talk about efficiency, and we will also talk about the advantages and disadvantages of a monopoly market, and perhaps we will also talk about price discrimination. Okay, let's go, let's start. All right, monopoly. So of course, this is a famous board game. You can start your lesson by asking your students if they have ever played that game. But honestly, this game doesn't have much to do with what we will be interested in. There is just a name that there is in common, but well, when we play the board game Monopoly, it's not really about a particular market structure, unless if you can purchase all streets. Yeah, if you can purchase all street, then you will be a monopolist, but I have played this game many times and I don't think this has ever happened. Okay, so what is a monopoly? That is the first skill that your students must learn. It's a market structure that is characterized by three main features. The first one is that there is one single seller that we call the monopolist, and sometimes students, they forget to mention how many buyers there are. Remember that when you describe a market, you must tell how many sellers there are, but you must also tell how many buyers there are. So in a monopoly, you have one single seller facing many buyers. So the consequence is that because this monopolist is the only one in the market, it doesn't face any direct competition. The second characteristic in this monopoly market is that the product that is sold by the monopolist has no close substitutes, which means that there is no way, if you believe that the monopolist charges a price that is too high for the product, there is no way you can purchase a close substitute from another business. So an example could be if you want to go from Beijing to, let's say, to Paris, well, you could take the train, but I don't really think that this is something that you are going to do. It's going to take a very, very long time. The only option that you have, pretty much, if you want to travel from Beijing to Paris, is to take the plane. So in this case, we would say that um, the airplane has no close substitute. Okay, so there is no indirect competition in the sense that the monopolist does not suffer from competition from businesses that produce close substitutes. And the last characteristic of a monopoly market is that they are prohibitive barriers to entry. Prohibitive means that they are so high that nobody can enter. If you have other businesses outside the market that consider to enter a monopoly market, it is simply not possible. It is too costly for them to enter this market, which means that the monopolist does not face any potential competition. So these are the three main characteristics which can be summarized by no direct, indirect, or potential competition. So the consequence is that this monopolist is going to benefit from a very strong market power. In particular, this business is going to use this market power to influence the market price. So obviously the monopolist is price maker. Okay, we'll talk about that in a minute. So because we have one single firm in this market, the individual demand curve of that firm is simply the market demand. Okay, remember when we were in perfect competition, there were a difference between the market demand and the individual demand simply because we had many sellers. Each seller was facing, you could say, a small segment of the total demand. You can put it this way. But in a monopoly, because there is one single firm, it faces all the consumers. It supplies the product to all the consumers in the market. It faces the entire market demand. And what do we know about market demand curves? They are usually downward sloping. This is a typical shape of a market demand curve, which means that the monopolist's average revenue, remember that the demand curve shows the average revenue of a business, the average revenue of a monopolist is decreasing, which means that the more output I want to sell, the lower the price that I have to charge. Okay, or to put it differently, the only way I can increase my output is by cutting the price. And you see that this is very different from what we had when we studied perfect competition. In perfect competition, the individual demand curve was horizontal, which means that each perfectly competitive firm did not have to cut the price to sell more output. It could sell as much output as it wanted at the market price. And it is for that reason that the average revenue of a perfectly competitive firm was equal to the marginal revenue. But things are different in a monopoly. The demand curve and the average revenue, they are downward sloping. So the firm has to cut the price in order to sell more output. And the consequence is that the monopolist's marginal revenue is smaller than its average revenue. For a very simple reason. If I intend to sell one more unit, then I have to cut the price. And there will be two effects on my total revenue. On the one hand, my total revenue will rise by the amount of the price at which I sell this last unit. But on the other hand, my total revenue is going to decrease by an amount that is equal to the decrease in price on all previous units. Sometimes we call the effect that increases my total revenue, we call that the quantity effect, because my total revenue increases because I produce one more unit. And the effect that decreases my total revenue because I now sell each unit at a lower price than before, we sometimes call that the price effect. And the consequence, because my demand is downward sloping, the marginal revenue is going to be smaller than the average revenue, which essentially means that when I sell one more unit, my total revenue will increase by less than the price at which I sell this last unit. Okay. So as I said earlier, monopolist is said to be price maker. It has a market power. And the decisions made by this monopolist, in particular decisions on how much output is going to be sold, will have an influence on the market price that is charged by this business. If the monopolist chooses to sell a low quantity, it will be able to charge a high price. But if this monopolist chooses to sell a large level of output, then it will be forced to charge a low price. So it is price maker, of course. Okay, and that's what I explain here. The more sales this monopolist intends to make, let me hide that, boom. The more sales the monopolist intends to make, the smaller the price that it can charge and vice versa. Okay, so how do we represent it? So this monopolist is facing a demand curve that is downward sloping. Remember that the demand curve is the average revenue of that business. Okay, so we know that. We know this is just a reminder that assuming that demand is a straight line, we know that the value of the point price elasticity is going to decrease as I move down along this demand curve. The demand is perfectly price elastic at the vertical intercept. It is perfectly price inelastic at the horizontal intercept. It is unit elastic at its midpoint. It is price elastic on the upper section, and it is price inelastic on the lower section. Okay, this is something that your students must already know, and that's why you have the reminders sign over here. Good. So that's the average revenue, and as I explained, the marginal revenue of a monopolist is lower than its average revenue. In particular, if demand is represented by a straight line, then the marginal revenue will have the same vertical intercept. So you see that they start at the same point, and the marginal revenue curve is going to be twice steeper than the average revenue curve, which means that it is going to cut the horizontal axis exactly at the middle point of this segment. Okay, to put differently, this distance is the same as this one. Okay, so make sure that your students, when they graph this type of diagram, make sure that they respect the proportion, that they make it on scale. Good. And this is the total revenue. This is also something that your students must know. When for all levels of output at which demand is price elastic, this is the upper section. If I increase output, so if I move down along my demand curve, my total revenue is going to rise, simply because demand is price elastic. So I do not need to cut the price a lot to sell one more unit. Okay, so that's why if I decide to cut the price to sell one more unit, my total revenue is going to increase. But on the lower section of the demand curve, demand is price inelastic. If I keep moving down along this demand curve, so I keep cutting the price to sell more output, then my total revenue would fall, simply because demand is price inelastic, and I need to cut the price significantly. I need to decrease the price a lot in order to sell just one unit. So it's not worth it. And at the end of the day, the conclusion is that the total revenue reaches its maximum when demand is price unit elastic, when the PED is equal to 1. Or in other words, when the marginal revenue is equal to 0. So you know that when firms maximize profit, they should produce the quantity of output at which MC is equal to MR. This is the profit maximizing rule. But if businesses intend to maximize their total revenue instead, then they should produce the level of output at which MR is equal to 0. And you can remember that the marginal revenue curve is simply the gradient of the total revenue curve. So it is indeed when the marginal revenue is equal to 0, the gradient is equal to, of the total revenue curve is 0, so it reaches this maximum over here. Okay, so these are reminders, but this is important to understand what comes next. All right, so how can we find the equilibrium in a monopoly? It is actually quite simple. Just like in any market structure, the profit maximizing rule is such that MC is equal to MR. So let's call QM the quantity at which this is the case. Careful, there is a mistake that students make pretty often at this stage. Once we have the quantity QM, we need to find the price at which we should sell this output. And sometimes students, they just once they have found QM, I will show you on the diagram, they make a mistake when identifying the optimal price. If we want to find the price at which the monopolist is going to sell this quantity of output, we start from the profit maximizing quantity, QM, and we go up to the monopolist demand curve, and we find, sorry, there is a typo here, and we find the corresponding price, which means that the price that is charged by the monopolist is simply the demand price at QM. I will explain that in a second once we have the diagram. Okay? All right. Yeah, I said that already. And you could tell your students that compared to the level of output QM at which we maximize profit is lower or smaller than the quantity at which we maximize total revenue, simply because the marginal cost is positive. Again, I will illustrate that with the diagram. It's going to be much easier. Okay, let's summarize first. Okay, so I have the average total cost, the marginal cost, demand curve, average revenue, and marginal revenue. Same vertical intercept, and the slope is twice steeper. The monopolist wants to maximize profit. The rule is MC is equal to MR. So we identify the profit maximizing quantity. The mistake that many students make, and you really have to make sure that they don't, to remind them that this is incorrect, is to say that then the price is here. And this is what they do. They will say that we have the profit maximizing price PM. And this is wrong. And there is a very simple way you can show them why this is wrong. Let me just modify a bit my demand curve. I'll just try to continue it to, yeah. You can just tell them, look, if the monopolist charges the price PM, the quantity demanded is not going to be QM. You can show them very easily, if you charge the price PM, the quantity that people or buyers will be willing to purchase is here. Okay, this would be the quantity demanded. This is not the optimal quantity. It's too much. The quantity demanded is too large, which means that I can charge a price that is higher than that. In particular, if I want buyers to demand exactly the profit maximizing quantity QM, then I should charge a price PM over here. It is when the monopolist charges the price PM that buyers are going to demand the profit maximizing quantity. I cannot charge a price greater than PM, because in that case, consumers will demand a quantity that will be lower than QM. And that's pretty much it. So this is what I mean when I say once we have found the optimal quantity QM, in order to find the optimal price, we go up until we meet the demand curve. And once we meet the demand curve, we read the corresponding price. So PM is the demand price at QM. Okay. Once we have the equilibrium price and quantity, we can identify the profit made by the monopolist. In order to find the profit, let me remind you that what you can remind is that profit is simply the price minus the average total cost times the quantity. So in order to identify the profit on your diagram, you must identify the average total cost at this quantity of output. So you just go up until you meet the ATC curve and you read the corresponding ATC. And then you just identify this area as the profit that is made by the monopolist. It's rather straightforward. Something that is interesting, and this is what I mentioned before, is that the quantity at which we maximize profit, and there are some MCQs about that, so you should really tell your students to be careful. The quantity at which we maximize profit is smaller than the quantity at which we would maximize total revenue. Let me try to illustrate it. I will just make it a bit longer. You see, if I ask you at which quantity does the monopolist maximize total revenue, the answer would be right. I'll choose a different color. The quantity would be right here. Yeah, that's still not the right color. Okay, never mind. But this quantity, yeah, when MR is equal to 0, this quantity. Is this always the case? Yes, it is always the case, as long as your marginal cost is positive. And this means something interesting. Since the profit maximizing quantity QM is lower than the quantity of output that maximizes total revenue, and remember that at this quantity that maximizes total revenue, demand is unit price elastic. The price elasticity of demand is equal to 1 at this quantity of output. It means that when a monopolist maximizes its profit, it lies on the price elastic section of the demand curve. If I represent it, so this quantity of output, the one on which I maximize my total revenue, so the demand curve would be right here, and at this point of the demand curve, the PED would be equal to 1. Okay. PED would be equal to 1. So if the PED is equal to 1 at that quantity of output, then all we have above or to the left of this quantity of output will lie on the price elastic section of the demand curve. Let me go back a bit in the slide, and this is exactly what I explained. Yeah, it follows that demand is locally price elastic at Qm. The price elasticity of demand in absolute value is greater than 1 at Qm. Sometimes you have essay questions, but not essay questions, but MCQs where they ask you what would happen to total revenue if we start from QM and if we increase or decrease the price. And if you want to know the answer to that question, you must remember that demand is locally price elastic at the equilibrium of a monopolist. What about efficiency? Do we achieve economic efficiency in this equilibrium? First, let's start with productive efficiency. Remember that in order to determine whether or not we achieve productive efficiency, the only thing that we have to do is to look at whether the business produces at minimum average total cost, produces the quantity of output at which the ATC curve is minimum. And you see that the quantity at which the ATC curve is minimum is this one, QPE. But we do not produce this quantity. We produce a level of output that is greater than QPE. This quantity QM does not minimize the ATC curve. And as a result, we can conclude that we do not achieve productive efficiency. There is productive inefficiency. Do we have allocative efficiency? Remember that allocative efficiency is achieved when the marginal cost of production, which is right there, is equal to the marginal benefit of consumption. And remember that the marginal benefit of consumption is simply the demand curve. So do we have MC is equal to MB, marginal cost of production is equal to marginal benefit of consumption at QM, at the profit maximizing level of output? No. We see that the marginal benefit of consumption here is equal to the price, PM, but the marginal cost of production is right here. I will call it MCM. So in particular, we see that the marginal benefit of consumption, marginal MBM, marginal benefit of consumption, which is equal to the price here, is greater than the marginal cost of production. And therefore, we do not achieve allocative efficiency. And if we do not achieve allocative efficiency, this means that there must be a deadweight loss. You can ask your students, in this case, if we want to increase total surplus, because again, if we do not achieve allocative efficiency, it means that we do not maximize total surplus. So what if we want to increase it? It's possible because it's not maximized. Should we produce more or should we produce less? Your students at that stage, they should know that when the marginal benefit of consumption is greater than the marginal cost of production, we can increase total surplus by producing more output, which means that we should move to the right. We should produce more to increase total surplus. You can even ask them to identify the allocatively efficient level of output where the marginal benefit of consumption is equal to the marginal cost of production. It's quite easy to see that this is going to be right there. We can call that QAE. Oops. This is the allocatively efficient level of output. This is at this level of output that total surplus is maximized. And finally, you could ask them to identify the deadweight loss caused by this market power. And there is a very simple rule to identify a deadweight loss on a diagram. It's always represented by the area between the quantity that you currently produce, QM, the quantity that is allocatively efficient, QAE. So the deadweight loss is always going to be somewhere in this range, okay, between these two levels of output, and between the marginal benefit of consumption and the marginal cost of production. So between the red curve and the blue line. So if you want to represent it, your deadweight loss would be represented by, it's going to be a very ugly, my apologies, it's going to be represented by this triangle. It's not exactly a triangle, but this would be the deadweight loss. I should buy a pen or something to make more beautiful drawing. This is the deadweight loss that is generated by this monopolistic market. So we don't have allocative efficiency, we don't have productive efficiency, not good. And of course, as a result, we do not have economic efficiency. Let's go back a bit to summarize these ideas. Okay, so since MR is, this is how you can explain it very easily, because the marginal revenue is smaller than the average revenue, which is equal to the price, it follows that at the equilibrium, the price is going to be greater than the marginal cost of production. And the price here is the marginal benefit of consumption, and therefore we do not achieve allocative efficiency. And of course, it's very unlikely that the firm, the monopolist, is going to produce exactly the level of output at which the ATC curve is minimized. It's not impossible. Theoretically, it's possible, but it's just very, very unlikely. So generally speaking, the monopolist does not achieve productive efficiency. Okay, and something that is interesting, remember when we studied perfect competition, in the short run, we distinguished between the short run, a time period where we had a fixed number of businesses, and the long run, a time period where firms had enough time to enter or exit the market. When we study the monopoly, we do not make any difference between the short run and the long run for one simple reason. The barriers to entry are so high that even if we let sufficient time to businesses to enter the market, they are unable to do so. Therefore, there is no difference between the short run and the long run, and it's not necessary to distinguish between the short run and the long run equilibrium of a monopoly. And remember when we studied perfect competition, it was possible for businesses to make positive economic profit in the short run, abnormal profit, but in the long run, all perfectly competitive firms made normal profit. And the explanation was to say that as soon as firms make profit in a perfectly competitive market, more firms are going to enter in the long run, and this profit is going to be competed away. But in a monopoly, if the monopolist makes abnormal profit in the short run, even though new businesses would like to enter the market to enjoy or to make some positive economic profit as well, but they are unable to do so because of the barriers to entry. So a monopolist is able to make abnormal profit even in the long run. So this is a key difference between perfect competition and monopoly. Okay. Good, good, good. All right, do you have any questions at that stage? Is there anything that is not clear about the equilibrium of a monopoly? Go ahead, if there is anything. And if not, you can just type okay, so I know that I can move on. Can I move on? Is this okay for everyone? All right, so now the next stage is to compare the outcome in perfect competition and the outcome in a monopoly. So the first thing that you can do is to to give a few reminders to your students about consumer surplus and producer surplus, but I'm not going to do that now. I will probably organize a webinar specifically dedicated to these concepts. So I'll skip this for now, but it's useful to help your students to review the difference between consumer surplus, total surplus, producer surplus, and so on. Okay, so let's compare these two market structures. And what we are going to do is we will consider a market that we assume to be perfectly competitive. Okay, so the initial stage is a perfectly competitive market. And then we will make a weird assumption, but it's going to help us understand. We will assume that all firms decide to merge. So you have thousands of businesses and they say, okay, let's all merge. So the market becomes a monopoly, because when these thousands or hundreds of businesses decide to merge, at the end of the day, there is one single big company supplying the entire market. So we move from a perfectly competitive market to a monopolistic market. And we will make another assumption. It's a bit complicated. We will simply assume that the supply curve in perfect competition is the same as the monopolist's marginal cost curve. This is the usual assumption that we make. It's a bit technical if we really want to understand what it means. So I think it's easier if you tell your students, just remember that this is the assumption that we make. And then we can compare the initial situation and the final situation. The initial situation is when we had this perfectly competitive market, and the final situation is when we had this monopolistic market. We can compare the equilibrium price, the equilibrium quantity, the consumer surplus, the producer surplus, the total surplus, and so on. And what we see, the conclusion that we can draw, is that the price in a monopoly is going to be higher than the price in perfect competition. This is the first line here. The output in a monopoly is lower than the output in perfect competition. The producer surplus in monopoly is greater than the producer surplus in perfect competition. The consumer surplus in monopoly is smaller than the consumer surplus in perfect competition. And overall, the total surplus in monopoly is lower than the total surplus in perfect competition. And the best way to understand that is to look at a diagram. So let's do that. Let's do that. Let's start with the initial situation where we have this perfectly competitive market. So in this market, you have the market supply, S, the market demand, D, and the market forces of supply and demand are going to determine the equilibrium price, P star, and the equilibrium quantity, Q star. Now let's identify consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus. You know that consumer surplus is represented by the upper triangle, whereas producer surplus is the lower triangle. So this is in perfect competition. I'm using star to indicate that this is the value of consumer surplus and producer surplus in the competitive equilibrium. And if I add these two areas, I will get the total surplus. You could even ask your students, where is the deadweight loss? And in this case, the conclusion would be there is no deadweight loss, simply because the supply curve is the marginal cost of production. The demand curve is the marginal benefit of consumption. In the absence of externalities, and I assume that there are no market failures. So we see that at Q star, the marginal cost of production is equal to the marginal benefit of consumption. So we achieve allocative efficiency. Oops, sorry. We do achieve allocative efficiency at Q star, and therefore total surplus is maximized. And if total surplus is maximized, there is no way we can make it bigger, so there is no deadweight loss. Okay, so this is what happens in perfect competition. Now, let's look at what happens in once all firms have merged. So once all firms have merged, the demand is the same. You see that the demand does not change, okay? Merging does not affect the demand for the product. But in this case, this market demand curve becomes the average revenue of the monopolist, of this single seller. And we can also represent the marginal revenue curve, same intercept as the average revenue and twice steeper. And remember the assumption that we made? We made the assumption that the marginal cost of the monopolist is the same as the market supply curve. Okay, you see that these are the same curve. Again, just tell your students that this is the simplifying assumption that we make. Otherwise, it's a bit complicated to compare the two market structures. The monopolist wants to maximize profit when MC is equal to MR. So we have QM, this is the quantity produced by the monopolist. And the price at which the monopolist is going to sell this output is PM, as I explained earlier. Once I have that, I can identify the consumer surplus in the monopoly, the area above the price and below the demand curve. And I can identify the producer surplus, the area below the price and above the supply curve. If I add these two areas, consumer surplus and producer surplus, I will get the total surplus. Is it maximum? Is it possible that we have a bigger surplus than that? Yes, absolutely. Again, let me do it again, but I explained that the quantity at which we have allocative efficiency would be right here, when the marginal cost of production is equal to the marginal benefit of consumption. And therefore, we see that the monopolist produces QM, but this is not the allocatively efficient quantity of output, which means that total surplus is not maximized. We could do better than that. Since at QM, the marginal benefit of consumption, which is right here, it's equal to the price. The marginal benefit of consumption is greater than the marginal cost of production, which is right here. This is my marginal cost of production. it is by increasing output that I would increase total surplus. So if I want to increase total surplus, I should move from QM to, let's call that Q star, because this is the notation that we had before, to Q star, the allocatively efficient level of output. So if we do not maximize total surplus at QM, it means that there is a deadweight loss. And again, the deadweight loss is easy to identify. I'll try a different strategy to identify the deadweight loss. The deadweight loss, actually I don't need to do that because I think I already have it. The deadweight loss, once we compare, is represented by this area. Okay, that's the deadweight loss, which means the loss in total surplus that is generated by this market power. We can be a bit more precise. Okay, we can compare, we can put the two things together. Remember that this big triangle was the consumer surplus in perfect competition. And in a monopoly, the consumer surplus is just this small triangle. So we have this area that is the lost consumer surplus. When we move from perfect competition to monopoly, this is what consumers lose. So not all of it is lost for everyone, because the blue shaded area used to be consumer surplus in perfect competition, and it becomes producer surplus in the monopoly. Remember, let me just go back. Remember, producer surplus is this big area, okay? So, which means that when we move from perfect competition to monopoly, there is this area which used to be consumer surplus and that is transferred to producers. So it's not lost to everyone. It's lost for consumers, but it's a gain for producers. So that's why it's not part of the deadweight loss. A deadweight loss is something that is lost for everyone. But on the other hand, this area here used to be consumer surplus. But then when we move from perfect competition to monopoly, it is not transferred to producers. So it is lost by consumers and it is not gained by producers. So it is lost to everyone. So that's why this area is a component of the deadweight loss. We can do the same thing with producer surplus. Remember that producer surplus in perfect competition was this big triangle. Producer surplus in the monopoly is this area. So we see that we have lost this area. This area used to be producer surplus in perfect competition. And when we move from perfect competition to a monopoly market, it is no longer part of producer surplus and it is not gained by consumers. So it is lost to everyone. So it is also part of the deadweight loss. Okay? So the loss in consumer surplus is A plus B, or minus A minus B. This is the change in consumer surplus. What consumers have lost. What producers have gained is plus A minus C. They have confiscated some of consumer surplus, area A, but they have lost area C. So overall, when I look the total change in total surplus, minus A plus A, well, it cancels out. Minus C minus B, this is your deadweight loss. So this is how you can identify the deadweight loss that is caused by a monopoly. Let me summarize these ideas here. Why is this the case? Why do we have a deadweight loss in a monopoly? Simply because the monopolist is going to use its market power to raise the price above the competitive level, the competitive price, leading to a lower level of output. And if there is a lower level of output than the allocatively efficient level, it means that there are some transactions that would improve total surplus, some transactions such that the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost, but that do not take place simply because the monopolist reduces output to maximize profit. And this loss in surplus, total surplus, is known as the deadweight loss. This is perhaps how you can define it. The deadweight loss is the difference between the maximum total surplus that you can achieve once you have allocative efficiency, and the total surplus that we achieve in a monopoly market. This is just the difference. And if you assume that demand and supply are linear, they are represented by straight lines, then you see that your deadweight loss is a triangle. This area is a triangle that we call the Harburger triangle. I don't really know how to pronounce that. It sounds German. The Harburger triangle. And you could calculate if you are given some figures about the price, the marginal cost, and the quantities in monopoly and perfect competition, then you would be able to calculate the size of this deadweight loss. Good. Do you have any questions? Is this okay about, this is a very typical essay question about perfect competition versus monopoly. Actually, let me try to do something. Let me try to share with you. I think I have typed the answer to an essay question that relates exactly to this topic. Hopefully I can find it. Not this one. Just give me a sec. All right. Let me share it. Look, I can send it to you if you want. This is a question from past paper. A firm in a perfectly competitive market and a firm in monopoly both seek to maximize their profit. Explain with the aid of a diagram why the levels of price and output might be different in the two markets. And I typed the entire key to this question. So this is part A. It's a very long answer, so don't worry, your students don't have to write such long answers, but it's meant to be comprehensive. And part B outline the condition that make, okay, and then this is something that we will do tomorrow, or as soon as we have, we schedule another webinar about price discrimination. But what we did today is summarized in this essay question. So the answer summarizes really everything that there is to know about monopoly versus perfect competition, the equilibrium in a monopoly, some characteristics in terms of efficiency, and yeah, to contrast these two market structures. Okay, I don't think I will go any further tonight, because then we start talking about the advantages and disadvantages of monopolies. Okay, we compare the monopoly market and perfect competition market, not the individual firm. So in the diagram, the demand curve, yes, in this diagram, absolutely, you're absolutely right. This is what happens in the market. This is not what happens for one individual firm. So this is the market supply, and this is the market demand. So that's why the demand curve, when we compare, is downward sloping. Absolutely. Any other questions? Anything else that you'd like to know about that, about the equilibrium in a monopoly market? Again, if you want me to send you the key, actually I can share it right here. So that's perfect. Let me share it with you. All right, I've just sent on the, if you open the chat box, you will find the key to the essay question that relates to the monopoly market. Should be useful. You will receive it in a few seconds. And if you have any questions, of course, please let me know. Is there anything else that is not perfectly clear? I'll give you 2 minutes to think about it. So I will not schedule webinars until, I'm not sure exactly, until Tuesday, probably. I'll take a break for a few days. And then once we meet again, we'll talk about the advantages and disadvantages of a monopoly market. We'll talk about X inefficiencies. We'll talk about economies of scale. We'll talk about dynamic efficiency. And I think the last thing that we must do is to talk about natural monopoly and price discrimination. I think that's natural monopoly, and price discrimination. So you see there is still a lot to do, but we should be able to complete this. We should be able to complete this topic on monopoly in one single webinar next week. I will share the information about when this webinar is going to be scheduled. If there are no more questions, I will stop here for tonight. And again, could you explain the formula for the equilibrium price for monopoly again? There is no formula. It's not really a formula. Monopolists want to maximize profit. MC is equal to MR. When you do MC is equal to MR, you don't find the price. You find a quantity. You find a quantity of output at which the marginal cost is equal to the marginal revenue. Let me just go back to the slide then. When the monopolist wants to maximize profit, it should produce the output at which MC is equal to MR. This is QM. Then once the monopolist knows how much output it needs to sell in order to maximize profit, the next question is, what is the price that I must charge in order to sell this quantity? In other words, what is the maximum price that buyers will be willing to pay to purchase this quantity? And the answer to that is the demand price at QM. It is by charging the price PM that consumers will demand exactly the quantity that maximizes my profit. If I charge a price below PM, I will not be able to sell as much as I want. And if I charge a price below PM, there would be more, the quantity demanded would be greater than the quantity that I want to sell. So in this case, I would have it means that I can raise the price. I should actually raise the price in order to charge the maximum price so buyers demand exactly the quantity that maximizes my profit. So I don't know if there is a formula. If you want me to write a formula, I can probably come up with something. So if you want to find the quantity, it's given by MC is equal to MR. Marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. And then the price, let's call that QM, the quantity QM. Quantity QM is such that MC is equal to MR. And then if you want the price PM is simply the demand for the quantity QM. You can put it this way. It's the demand price at QM, the price that maximum price consumers are willing to pay to purchase the quantity QM. It's not really a formula. Does it make sense? Yes? Again, what you can do with your students, as I said earlier, because many of them make the mistake, so you really need to tell them to be careful. Many of them will say that the price is here. You can just prove them that it's wrong. You can just tell them, hey, look, if you charge this price, buyers will be willing to buy a much greater quantity. Buyers will be willing to buy this quantity. This is not the quantity that you want to sell. you want to sell only QM. For example, let's say it's 10 units. Let's say that QM is 10. That's what you must sell to maximize your profit. If you charge this price, let's just call it P1. If you charge the price P1, the quantity demanded is 20. So you want to sell 10, and you see that the quantity demanded is 20. So it means that the price that you charge is too low. So you raise the price until the quantity demanded, so you raise the price, boom, until the quantity demanded is equal to 10, the quantity that you want to sell in order to maximize your profit. Any other questions? Are we good? Okay. Then I wish you all a very nice evening, and I will see you next week. I don't know yet which day, but I will keep you posted, of course. Have a good night, everyone, and see you soon. Bye-bye.